Do you know what a clinical psychologist does and how it relates to private practice? In this episode of the Molding Private Practice Show, we speak to Nicky Abdinor, a clinical psychologist based in South Africa, about her experiences of becoming a clinical psychologist and going into private practice. Before we start, I want to mention that this episode of the show is sponsored by KITRIN and our ISO Evolve Adaptive Practice Management software. At KITRIN, we know that healthcare practitioners in private practice want to serve their patients in the best way possible and with the highest service levels, which models the professional level in their therapeutic space with their patients. In our experience, most healthcare practitioners find out and upskill on the why, what, when, and who parts of private practice, but the how part is often not answered in as much detail as it could be. That's the reason that we reimagine how a traditional practice management software or medical billing software would work to allow our clients to start with an account that has everything you need to get your admin and billing done and allow them to upgrade within minutes to a product offering where they have a dedicated team. If you are a healthcare practitioner in private practice and want to see how our ISO Evolve Adaptive Practice Management software can help you in your private practice to reduce your time, anxiety, and effort around private practice management functions, please go to www.kitrin.com/podcast and someone from our team will contact you to discuss how this could work for you. And now, on to the episode. Nicky Abdinor, welcome to the show. So we're so glad to have you on board and speaking about being a clinical psychologist, private practice, and all of that great stuff. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks, Oliver. Great to be on your show.
Yeah, it's an honor. Like I said in the Molding Health episode, been looking forward to this for weeks, and I kind of, we kind of cross paths, and I love your story. I love everything about what you're doing in the world at the moment. But I wanted to ask you, to if firstly, how would you introduce yourself in the episode? Because I think that's important to bear in mind.
Well, I think I'll do the same intro that I did in the last episode that we did together. But I always say that I was born without arms, but not without attitude. I'm a clinical psychologist. I am the founder of a registered nonprofit organization in South Africa called Nicky's Drive. And I'm also a professional speaker. So I speak at conferences and events, and which has fortunately taken me around the world at times, which is really great. So generally just an overachiever.
I love that. Yeah, and bearing in mind, obviously, this podcast is more for aspiring healthcare practitioners and also practitioners that are on that fence of going into private practice or not. And bearing that in mind, how would you like someone to remember this episode?
I think the most important thing is to think about it's possible to start a private practice no matter who you are and at what stage you are at your career. And when I tell my story about private practice, people are quite like amazed to think of like how few resources I had and how little information I had. I literally had to learn from scratch. And there was no one to help me. I mean, even back then, Google wasn't very helpful at that time. So I really learned, and I always say to people, it took a couple of years of making a lot of mistakes before I actually knew how to run a private practice. So it really makes me passionate to teach others on how to start a private practice. So the main message is just that it's possible. With a lot of support and dedication and creativity, it is possible to start anywhere.
Okay, I love that. We're going to come into it, in a few minutes because I think you're doing some incredible work with practitioners in terms of your private practice boot camp, which we'll speak about. Because I agree with you. I think the first thing is to understand the why, the how, and the when part. And I think you're doing that part like really well in the world. Where people they do have that resource where they can go to that. But if we start setting the stage now, and the other question I've been asking for many practitioners over many episodes is when you were young, and like I'm thinking, normally under 10 or so, people always ask you, what do you want to do when you grow up? Did a young Nikki say that she wanted to be a clinical psychologist?
Absolutely not. A young Nikki didn't know what a psychologist was. I mean, I think at 10 I've gone through my moments in life, but I definitely remember at 10 years old I wanted to read the news on TV. I don't know why, but that's what I wanted to do. And then when I got to my teenage years, I wanted to be a DJ on the radio.
Okay.
Just to give a little hint about like personality and stages of life in teen years, I wanted to actually be on 5 FM and I wanted to take over Barney Simon's show,
Oh,
like the
wow. Nice.
heavy metal kind of show. So that was really what I wanted to do, but it was only when I was about 17 years old that I was first introduced to psychology. So I always say things happen for a reason, and I had a new friend that came to our school, and she suffered from depression and anxiety, and she had terrible panic attacks. It was just the first time that I could see how a psychological challenge can impact on your functioning as much as a physical one, because I have a physical disability and I've always been focused on that. And it was the first time to recognize how the mind can disable you. And it really fascinated me. I was so interested in understanding like her perspective of the world. And during our school holiday, she actually was in a clinic in Cape Town, and I visited her there, and I just knew like I needed to do this type of work. And if I hadn't met her, I don't think I ever would have studied psychology.
I love that story. And that's the reason I love asking the question as well. Because I think, firstly, it's, like there's always a story with that. And like with all of us, I mean, whether you're a healthcare practitioner or not, but I love the story of healthcare practitioners because most of the time, they never knew that that's what they wanted to do when they were under five. I think I've only encountered a handful that said, I definitely wanted to do that. And those are probably the more, like adjusted ones, maybe definitely younger, maybe, because they lived in a world where that was possible or they knew about it. Um, and the process of getting into, because this is, okay, so once you have that seed planted, the next hurdle is actually getting into a program or starting on your academic journey. Did you find that that was quite easy to do?
Oh, no. And I mean, every psychologist has got like repressed memories of what happens when you want to become a psychologist, and you're only 18 years old. And in retrospect, I mean, that's understandable. What do you know about life at 18? But the message is when you arrive at university, even if the message was given to me when I applied to university to say, like, only 8 people get selected for masters. You're never going to be selected. So rather apply for something different. So I actually did a BA in social work first. And that was just because they told me you're not going to get into masters. So I took psychology and social work as majors. And then, halfway through that degree, I thought, but why am I doing a BA in social work? I want to be a psychologist and I'm just going to try. So I loved social work. It was an incredible grounding for me. But I did 3 years of social work and psychology, and then I went into my honors in psychology. And again, a class of, roughly about 60 students at Stellenbosch University. Everyone wants one of those 8 spots for the
Mm,
clinical program. So competition is rife.
mm,
And I was just very fortunate that I was selected in that year. I mean, many people are only selected much later in life with a bit of years of experience, but I like to believe that, my life experience probably of living with a disability and having a different perspective on life perhaps gave me a chance at getting into masters. So it wasn't easy, but reflecting back, I think it was a really good process and something I know a lot of people struggle with to get into that program.
mm. I love that. And I think because I think everyone has horror stories about getting that board approval to go into the master's program. And when you said about the competition, I was thinking of something else. Is that did you find in your honors class that it was like competitive as well? But
Oh,
would people knowing
yeah.
that there's only 8 slots? I mean, so there must have been lots of I want to
So
say
we were focused
lobbying.
on marks, and you're so used to, I mean, this is a concept at school, if you were good academically, you stood out, then you get to university and suddenly like there are a lot of people that are good academically. But then in honors, now everybody has strong marks. I actually remember our first assignment that we had to, or first test that we did in honors, and our marks were put up on a board. And I think that almost at the same. I don't know if people first looked at what their marks were or if they first assessed what the other marks were like.
Hmm.
So it was just seeing, and then I kind of seeing like who's the competition. But people forget it's not all about marks. Marks are really important, but there are a lot of other factors that help you get into masters.
Yeah, yeah. I think you alluded to that in terms of the, the what they're also looking for, from what I've gathered. We've never had a board member on, but it's like the adversity and your resilience to be able to deal with challenges and stuff like that. So looking at something more all-rounded, rather than pure academics. And I think this was always, in some of the previous episodes kind of testify to this, is that, people that, or practitioners that thought that it was purely academics, or, they could just get, straight A's and that was it. They normally, it never worked like that. It was, and they had to go in, once or twice, or
Yeah.
twice or thrice or so.
Both marks definitely get you an interview because
Mm,
the reality is it's an incredibly emotionally and academically taxing course to do your master's. So they want to know that you can cope academically so that that's not going to be an issue
mm, mm,
with all the other stuff that comes up. So your marks get you into the interview room, but then after that, your marks are actually irrelevant. It's now about who you are as a person, how you've dealt with adversity, as you say, how you plan to deal with a career in psychology, and also just knowing that you the type of person or personality that is suited to this career. Not everybody can sit in a room with someone and understand how the mind works and help people feel comfortable about opening up.
mm. On the plus side, or the positive side, it's, I mean, it must be a really gratifying feeling knowing, with your skills and your experience and your life experience, that you can actually help someone in such a tangible way, and really make a difference. I mean, that must be incredible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I just think that you don't take it for granted. I mean, I don't think anybody forgets what the road is like, and I think there's a lot of luck involved as well. Yes, it's hard work,
Mm.
it's your personality, your experiences, but there's a lot of luck involved too. I mean, I've heard of some lecturers going through applications where everybody is just so good and decided to choose the people that printed in blue instead of black ink.
Oh, wow.
That's what it came down to at the end, to select the final few for interviews. Now it's all typed, so I'm not sure what they're doing.
Yeah, that's funny. I've never heard of that before, actually. Or the ones with neat handwriting. That's funny. And you're obviously a clinical psychologist, so that normally has a slightly different variation, definitely in South Africa. Can you tell us through, can you take us through that? Because I think you go through a community service here. And
Yes.
the reason I ask that as well is because I get mixed emotions around this. Some people love it, some people hate it. But what was your experience?
Well, yeah, so your master's in clinical psychology is 1 year full-time student where you're doing classes, assignments, a thesis, seeing clients in therapy and supervision, so it's full time. And then your second year is a full time internship where you do get paid. And I worked at Tygerberg Hospital in Cape Town and worked at the adolescent and child psychiatry department, the adult psychiatry department, and then actually did my last rotation at Stellenbosch University student counseling. So I had quite an interesting variation of that year. And then your third year as a clinical psychologist, it doesn't happen for counseling or educational or industrial psychology even. You do a community service year, and as you say, there's a lot of mixed emotions. For me, I think I was only the second year ever that did community year, service year as psychologist. Before then, it was only doctors. And at least we had had the first run of students doing it, so I had a little bit of an idea. I think the biggest problem is that people were sent far and wide. And you kind of always thought, okay, this is where I live, this is where my family are, and now suddenly you sent to a location that a lot of people literally had to Google. Like, I don't even know where this place is, what province is it, how big is it, where am I going to live? It's very stressful. And I always say there are sometimes advantages to having a disability, and I'm not afraid to use those advantages. But for me, it was just absolutely not practical to have to move somewhere else away from my support system. So I did put that in my motivation for a community service year. So luckily, I was placed in Cape Town, whereas many of my friends were placed all over. And I went to Lentegeur Psychiatric Hospital in Mitchell's Plain, and I worked in the forensic unit. And I was so excited about it because it's again like these kind of images that you get in the media about psychologists. Everyone either wants to be a child psychologist or they want to be like a forensic profiler or be on like CSI or something. So the forensics psychology was a real eye opener at what it means to work in that field. So I found it incredibly valuable and interesting. But I left that year knowing like, okay, forensics is not for me full term, long term. And, I think that's so important. Sometimes you have to experience something to know whether it's right or wrong for you.
Yeah.
So I think it really shaped my career and it also helped me have an extra year of guaranteed income, number one, and also supervision, access to academic spaces. So it was really a great opportunity to learn. So I always say to people, I mean, I know it's really difficult if you are sent somewhere very far away. I mean, I've no doubt, like families are sometimes separated because of it, but there are a lot of advantages to doing that community service here.
Yeah. And I think the other thing I would say to that, because I agree with exactly what you said, is that especially in a South African context, and I suppose anywhere in the world, but it almost forces you to be in this space that you would probably never have gotten to. Like there's no way anyone intentionally would go, to some of those areas or help those people. So in some ways, from a growth point of view, it does stretch you a bit, in terms of that. So,
And
good
it's so
on you.
interesting because one or two of my friends from Masters, they ended up staying on in their community service placements. They actually enjoyed living in Mpumalanga, you know, Bloemfontein area, like wherever they were sent. And they stayed on for another year or two, which I think is great. Some even met their partners
Mm.
those years.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. But if you said you were in the second batch, there would have been a time when obviously you didn't get paid that much as well. Because I know my wife, when she did her community service, I mean, they got paid minimal. Like, compared to what, people are getting paid now. Did you find that that was a thing as well?
You know what's so funny is that because I studied, from finishing school, I went into varsity, first, second, third year honors, and straight into masters. So I'd never known like the paid world out there, which I know many people experience. But each year, even in my internship, we were paid such a minimal amount.
Mm.
When I hear what interns are paid now, I think, oh my goodness. And then
Yeah.
I thought I was rich. Like I'd
Okay.
never had so much money in my life. And before, luckily, I was on a bursary while I was studying, which covered a lot of expenses.
Mm.
But I just felt like, wow, this is the most money I've ever seen in my bank account.
Mm.
The great thing is in that community service year, I actually bought my first property because I had this nice salary slip and it was a decent amount. I mean, probably for the majority of people, not if you're looking after a family, I mean, I wouldn't recommend it.
Mm.
But then I just felt like, oh my goodness, I've got so much money, even though I know it wasn't a lot.
Oh wow. I suppose it's all context, and I suppose when
Yeah.
we compared, and like so, I think it was. We just started going out or so, and my wife was like, she showed me a salary slip, and I was like, wow, this is after like 3 degrees and how many years of study and all of that stuff. And it was, I mean, if I can remember right, it was like under 5,000 rands or something, or around that mark. That was how much it was.
I
Um,
think I've got like 10,000 Rand in my mind for
okay, maybe it could be
psychology.
that. I remember it was between 5 and 7 or so, but I can't think it more than 10. But but that's good to know. I mean, again, always context, but it's
Yeah, it's a perspective and yeah,
but
absolutely.
yeah, and I think the positive, if you are an aspiring, practitioner listening to this, or clinical psychologist, is I mean, it has improved quite a lot. I mean, I think the rates now are much better. A lot more. Where you think actually that's pretty cool. That's it's probably a decent enough job.
Yeah.
And after community service, did you go straight into private practice, or did you work somewhere else?
Yes. So, I mean, I always say to people starting out, I know when you finish community service, it's quite scary because there are not many permanent jobs for clinical psychologists. You might have to work in a state hospital and, you have to think about all your options. So, I think that if there had been a post available at that time, I probably would have taken it, but there wasn't anything. So I just decided, well, how am I going to make this work? And I started out with, I was already doing a bit of part-time lecturing for Varsity College after hours. So I decided to continue with that and took on a few extra courses because I thought then that would be some guaranteed income for me. And I loved lecturing, and also a hospital, also in Mitchell's Plain, which was the Western Cape Rehab Centre, which is a physical rehab centre. I approached them and they managed to get a part-time post, 10 hours a week. I believe now they have a full-time psychologist. So back then I had those two permanent incomes just to keep me afloat. And then I had to launch into private practice. So sometimes starting private practice is not always your first choice, but something you're forced into. And at that stage, I looked around, I decided to just stay in my own area where I was living, and I found a speech therapist who had a house. And she had space, sometimes her locums would be working in different hospitals or schools. So then I rented sessional space from her, and it was a Tuesday and a Thursday afternoon and a Saturday morning. And I always joke to people is that when you new, you don't want to tell people, "Oh, congratulations, you my first client I've ever seen." Like, how to make people run away from you. So I remember saying, "Oh, I'm fully booked. I've only got availability on Tuesday afternoon, Thursday afternoon, and Saturday morning." And that's where I built the practice. I mean, I had no business experience at all. And I mean, also that whole dynamic of asking someone for money now. You're used to working in a state service where people generally aren't paying, to now suddenly having this monetary aspect and feeling like, well, I know a lot of young therapists think this and they tell me this in supervision, like, was that really was that hour worth what I took from them? Because, it's just so different and we're not taught to run a business. We're not taught to ask for money. It just changes the dynamic. It works for some people, it doesn't work for others.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose this is that point we mentioned in the other episode around imposter syndrome, and everyone, saying, is my time really worth that much? But I think for psychologists, well, for all practitioners, what's a really good guiding principle, whether you like it or not, is like, looking at the medical aids or the health insurance companies and saying, actually, we think a psychologist for an hour session should be paid, 1,197. And
Mm.
I think for you as well, when you think about that, it's like, okay, cool, that's what my time is worth. Whereas,
Mm.
like if I think of coaches and stuff like that, I don't know how they benchmark their rates and say, I want to charge, I don't know, 500 rands or 2,500 rands. I don't know how you
Yeah,
benchmark that.
yeah, true, absolutely.
Yeah. which is great. And private practice itself, did you? This is probably a good point to mention, and I would love to hear your story around the boot camp because I think you obviously found enough of a need of other practitioners complaining about the same issues that you probably had to go through. I'm just guessing, that you had to go through to create something as valuable as like a private practice group, private practice boot camp. Can you take us through that thinking?
Okay, well, it's actually quite interesting because, as I said, starting out, didn't know anything, and I learnt along the way. Like, I honestly think when I started, I was thinking back, I don't even know if I knew what medical aids paid. I just didn't know how anything worked. And as I started to learn more, because obviously a group of friends, from masters, from community service, we all starting at a similar time. As a group of friends, we would always, share information. But I found that a lot of times people were, again, cagey. Remember I said about the competition in honors?
Mm.
Back then, there was massive competition. I know it still exists now, but it felt worse. There was kind of not this community of sharing. It was like everyone was on their own and like wanted to keep hold of all the clients that they had and didn't want to tell people, what they were charging or how they were billing or, it was like a secret. So the more I started to learn about things, the more I started telling my friends and telling people, oh, this is what you do. And, it's also related to social work when I think of my own personality. Because, as I said, I did my first 3 years in social work. I remember very strongly in masters, I was the most clued up on resources in Stellenbosch because I'd worked as a social work student. So I'd been to all these clinics, these organizations, NGOs. So everyone joked like I was the yellow pages for any like services. Like I knew exactly, okay, we must refer them to this, we must do that, let's speak to that social worker. So I was very much into collaborating and helping. And, the same thing happened with private practice. Then, say, over the course of my first decade or so, I was always helping. Like people would phone me and say, Nikki, what do I do with this? What do I do with that? I will say, oh, email me your invoice and let me check it out and I'll tell you what you have to add. Not everyone did accounting at school. Luckily,
Mm.
I did. And it grew from there. And then I'd always wanted to help others more officially. And then because I'd been traveling quite a bit, my life was extremely busy leading up to COVID. And then COVID hit, and suddenly everything was quiet, everything was working differently. I had a lot more time. And that's when I thought, oh, well, let me start a private practice support group. And that's how it started, where I'd have different topics for each meeting, and different people would join online via Zoom and I would, do a little bit of education in the session and then we would support each other open ended. And then what happened following from that, I started realizing, but not everyone could attend each support group. So people were missing bits of information. So they would miss out on the marketing support group or they'd miss out on billing. So then I thought, no, I need to consolidate all of this into one course. So I decided to do the boot camp. I used the word boot camp because we know like boot camp can be grueling. Anyone who comes out of a boot camp wants to die. I hope nobody leaves my boot camp wanting to die. But it's just that it's so much information. It's intensive. But I've realized people don't have the time. Like if I had to, in an ideal world, that boot camp would run over 2 full days. But people don't have the time. So I've condensed it into just over 2 hours. So it's really like just like a crash course in private practice. But then there's a lot of support after that. So anybody that does my boot camp, they belong to a private Facebook group that I run and they can ask any question there.
Ah, okay.
And I'm like quite obsessive with helping people. I know it's like, I don't know if it's a character flaw, but I love it when people post a question, like I just want to answer, I want to help them. So that's kind of the advantage, and I think that's the even the better part to the boot camp is that there's this continued support. I tell
Yeah.
people a lot of the stuff you learn in boot camp won't even make sense until like maybe 3 months' time, you have to send your first invoice. Then suddenly, like, what did Nikki say about invoicing?
Mm,
And then I thought, well, we'll ask it, and my philosophy is there's no such thing as a silly question because people are scared to ask silly questions.
mm,
And like absolutely anything, if you don't ask the basics, like how are you ever going to understand? So I do want to believe, I don't know if it's just through my boot camp, but I believe in general that the profession of psychology has changed, especially with social media. People are trying to help more. And I think the more you help, the more it becomes a bit contagious. Like I've
mm.
noticed on a psychology Facebook group, like an open group to psychologists, and then someone will post a question and then you'll find like 10 people want to answer it and help them, and I think it's because they saw the first person helping, oh wait a minute, like maybe I should also help too. And I think it's kind of changed the dynamic. It's not as cagey. You don't have to hold on to information. Why must people learn from scratch?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I love that. I mean, there's lots of negative things in the world, but this is definitely one of those positive things. I think, the fact that it's much more open, and again, we can thank COVID for that. Even having this conversation, I think, before 2020, when we would try to ask practitioners, can we set up an online meeting? It was always like resistance, like it was always, can you come and see me at my practice? And after 2020, this whole world opened up in front of us, which was incredible to see.
Yeah.
And I think going back to your boot camp, because I just want to talk about that, because what you cover is lots of the things that we talk about, like here as well, around the challenges. And I think the one thing that comes up very strongly, and every practitioner says the same thing, it's like, I wish they told me more about this at university, like about how do we do this thing and how do we become a business person, because you don't come out of university with your MBA. You went down the masters in psychology kind of route. And I would take that even further and say, I think, and again, this is more my opinion, but most healthcare practitioners are not in that mindset of that. There's like a mental block around it. And I think just hearing it and just saying, yes, I know you don't like this. I know this is not a topic you want to consider in your life, but if you're going into private practice, you do have to know about the legal. You do have to know about medical billing. You do have to know about, how do you send out your forms and all of those things. And, whether you like it or not, that's part of the pain you almost have to go through. And I think that's what your course kind of, like brings out, at least an awareness of it. Do you find the same? Do you find like when practitioners come in, it's like that's the overwhelming part?
Yes, I think so. What popped into my mind when you were saying this is just thinking that, because psychologists are who they are, um, you know, we are trained to be like a mystery, that like we're almost not real human beings.
Mm, mm,
And, like we don't talk about ourselves. And, if somebody asks you a personal question, you must reflect on what the meaning of that question is. So if someone says, are you married? You must go, it seems important for you to know whether I'm married or not. Tell me what that's about. Like that's kind of how we were trained.
mm,
And actually having a thriving, successful private practice that is also rewarding for yourself entails actually being a lot more open to people and showing up a little bit more about who you are as a person, because that's what people do nowadays. They don't just say, oh, well, my GP said I must go to this therapist and here's their name and phone number. They will go and Google you and look you up and it's like, does this person resonate with me? Why do they not have a digital footprint? Like, what they hiding? So I do think that therapists have to work a little bit differently to how it was before the digital age. I know a few successful therapists that have no digital footprint, and they are the outliers, but they have other skills in networking and connections that have built their practices. But I do want to say what I was saying earlier popped into my mind is that a lot of therapists will say, I don't deal with medical aids. I don't deal with this. I don't deal with that. And my answer to that is, well, then you're not servicing the client and what they need. Because the majority of people that are coming to you are in a mental health crisis. And the overwhelming nature of medical aids and forms and billing is just too much for them to bear. And if you don't know what their medical aids offer and you don't help them access those resources, I don't think you're doing a good job as a therapist. So, sometimes people say to me, Nikki, you make things so easy. And I know I do spoon feed people. Like, that's like just one of my character traits. But I believe in making things easy for people because they don't have the capacity sometimes to do it for themselves. They might phone a therapy office asking for an appointment, finding out how much it costs, and then thinking, oh my goodness, I'm not going to afford that. But they haven't been given, you know, the the resources to know, like, oh wait, your medical aid, if you meet a certain condition criteria, you might be able to apply for prescribed minimum benefits, which means it's 15 appointments outpatient or 21 days in a hospital. So those are the kinds of things that I think we need to empower people to know so that they can afford and access therapy. So don't say I don't deal with medical aids. You need to deal with medical aids. Maybe you don't have to claim directly from them, but you need to be able to empower people and make it easy for them to access your resources.
Yeah, I love how you said that. Yeah, that's and again, it's taking a firstly a different perspective on the world, which is your client's view of the world, which I think most practitioners don't have an issue doing, but it's thinking about it like in a different angle, maybe. The other one is, I mean, we're living in a world of I would say abundance. So if you weren't offering that, and and you didn't come up on Google, they're gonna find another name because normally therapists have to give I don't think they just give one name, they give three names, and then the patient makes their mind up on who they want to speak to. They're gonna go to the second name. It's like, okay, that therapist does offer medical, like
Yes,
submission to medical aid, and you kind of lost on that little battle, around that, and I think it's worth knowing it. And I think that's the reason I always advocate for that. Things like your boot camp is because at least you know what it is. The same reason we do the podcast is at least you know what it is. How you kind of maneuver your life and what decisions you make after that, I mean, that's completely up to you. But at least you know, like and you can't say I didn't know about that.
yes, yes.
And in terms of COVID-19, and I think you mentioned it. I mean, I think this question is becoming a little bit. It's funny. The funny thing with life is like you can't even remember some of the things. But can you remember what a difference COVID-19 or that whole pandemic time played in your life and your private practice?
Yeah, it was obviously an interesting time and a challenging time. And I think, it's changed my practice. I mean, if I had to go to my 2019 self and look at what my working life was then and what it is like now, it's completely different. So I moved to an online therapy practice and I stayed online. I'm one of the few. And it works for some people, it doesn't work for others. But for me, it has worked well to stay online. But for a lot of people, they went through really different phases in their careers. But for me, it was about actually like investing a lot more time in my own training and upskilling. So as I said to you in our last interview, that I did a lot of training in schema therapy, managed to attend their international conferences that were normally just totally out of reach, but now I could listen online to all these presentations from around the world. And then also, starting a lot of supervision with other therapists, starting my private practice boot camp, and just having that access to online resources where now your location wasn't an issue. I think that's quite powerful. I also started a schema therapy peer supervision group, and everyone is a therapist in different parts of South Africa, and that's so amazing. Like 2019, if I was in a supervision group, it would be like who lives in the area and would be able to make this meeting. And I think a large part of the time I didn't attend some of those sorts of things because it wasn't feasible for me due to my schedule. So it just opens up so much. And I think also from a disability perspective as well. I mean, I know in general, people with disabilities, really flourished actually, even though there was obviously this huge health threat and fear and being very vulnerable. On another level, when it came to the workplace, it made it so much more accessible. People with disabilities had been pleading with companies to work from home or have hybrid setups, and it really opened up the opportunities for them. And I think for me, online therapy is a lot more accessible for me as a person.
I love that, and I think it's congruent with many of the stories I've heard, from other practitioners. And the reason I love, where we are, from a world point of view, is to be able to have access to people like yourself, irrespective of geographical location. In terms of advice for anyone considering becoming a clinical psychologist, someone listened to this and was like, wow, okay, cool. I don't want to be a news reporter anymore. I do want to become a clinical psychologist. Is there anything that you would say to someone like that?
I think actually start your own therapeutic process. There's no better way to understand what it is to be a therapist than to be in therapy yourself. So I know that that's very useful. And I mean, if it's starting from scratch to become a clinical psychologist, it is a long journey. And I'm not going to be one of those people to say you're never going to be selected. There's remember I said like I'm a realistic optimist. I think I said, I didn't use those words, but that's what I am. And, there is a chance you might not be selected, but that doesn't mean it's the end of the road for you. Like maybe there are other opportunities, or the education that you receive takes you in a different direction. So it's not all about doing a master's in clinical psychology. So yeah, speak to people in the profession, hear about what they like about it, what they hate about it, what's difficult. Because again, like I said, having done that community service year in forensics told me as much as I enjoyed it, I grew from that year, I didn't want to work in forensics long term. And it's the same for psychology, that maybe you have this glamorized picture of what it means to be a therapist. And, like a lot of times people think, oh, if you're a therapist, you've got to be kind and caring and self-sacrificing. And actually, yeah, those might be parts of what you need to be, but you also need to have good boundaries. You need to be able to separate work and personal life. Otherwise, you won't cope. It's a lot to take on people's stories and trauma and difficulty, and it's not for everybody.
Yeah, and just prioritizing yourself. I think lots of therapists speak about that as well, in terms of that. And my second last question is there anything that you would say to someone that wants to go into private practice? Either they're in the community service or they're working somewhere and they're scared to take this jump.
Take the jump. I advise. Join my boot camp. It's really helpful because a lot of people that join that boot camp, they might also be thinking of private practice. So they might be fresh out of internships or community service here. They might be in full-time employment thinking of going into practice. And some people have even been in private practice for many years, or they've come out of maternity leave or raising children over many years. So people are at such different phases, and it's always so helpful because what I love about the boot camp is that you're already creating a community of support, and that's the only way you're going to do it. The people that are really successful from a early start have made connections with other people that are maybe more advanced in their career. I mean, for me, there's nothing better than meeting a competent new therapist to private practice, and I know that I can refer all my overflow to them because they're going to have availability. Because that's a big problem with therapy at the moment, is people like taking the plunge, having the courage to phone for an appointment, and then hearing that you can only see them in 2 months' time. I don't want to say, unfortunately, I don't have any availability for the next 2 months. Here's somebody. And then I know they're going to phone that person who's going to say, oh, I also don't have availability for another 6 weeks. I want to give them one of the three names is somebody that I know will actually make a plan to see them in the next week or so. So that's how you're going to build your practice about being the person that wants to work on a Saturday, that is keen for the casualty departments to send somebody that's just had a massive panic attack to see them that afternoon.
Yeah.
That's the kind of enthusiasm and energy you need to get started. And then you start to find what is your niche, what are you interested in. So those connections are going to be so important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Evenings, Saturdays, Sundays, just to initially just to kick it off. I think that's really amazing advice. And the last question, just to wrap it up, anything that you thought I should have asked you that I didn't, that I think we covered a lot around, being a psychologist and private practice, but anything
Yes.
else?
Google yourself. I always tell people, Google yourself incognito. And if you don't know what that means, Google how to Google yourself incognito and have a look what's online about you. And if there's nothing about you online, fix that. Start at the very minimum with a LinkedIn profile. It's free, it's professional, and it goes high in your Google rankings. If people put your name in, your LinkedIn profile often is one of the first things that pops up. And get your name listed on as many platforms, and a lot of them are free. If you find that there's something that you don't like, I always laugh about one of the people that joined my initial support groups in COVID. She, after one of my meetings, she went and Googled herself and she just sent me a message like, Nikki, I've nearly had a heart attack. I've discovered I've got this Twitter account that I opened when I was like about 18 years old. And like all those things that I tweeted, like I don't believe in that anymore. That's not who I am. I'm now 28 and I'm a professional person. So she immediately deleted that Twitter account. But so like little things like that, you don't know what's going to come up for you. And it's good to know what people will find, and that's your business card out there. Whether you like it or not, that's how people are going to find you.
That's amazing advice. I mean, it's such a easy one to do, and I think it's accessible to everyone, but it's pretty
Yeah.
potent.
But we don't think about it.
Yeah, I love it. And on that note, we do need to wrap up, and I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your time with us. I think it was an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, thanks so much, Oliver.
Hi everyone, thanks for listening. If you like this content, please subscribe to our channel, like the video, and leave a comment in terms of what you did like and what content you would like to see in the future. This helps us to keep doing what we're doing. And as a reminder, if you are a healthcare practitioner in private practice and want to see how our ISO Evolve adaptive practice management software can help you in your private practice to reduce your time, anxiety, and effort around private practice management functions, please go to www.kitrin.com/podcast, and someone from our team will contact you to discuss how this could work for you.